Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the dark side. I'm your host, Sherry. I know you're all busy these days. Holidays are right around the corner. That's why it's great to take breaks and listen to some true crime. Maybe listen while you're wrapping presents. Real quick, this is the last update I'll be providing on the Charles and Catherine Romer case. Last week's update was they pulled a car out of a pond in Brunswick, Georgia. Well, this week it was 100% confirmed to be Charles and Catherine's Lincoln Continental. If you go to the Sunshine State Sonar Facebook page, they uploaded 60 photos from the recovery. Seeing Catherine's shoes and purse and Charles' belt and all these possessions of theirs was emotional. I hope the family can now have their minds at ease and Charles and Catherine can finally come home. Today we're talking about a grandmother in her 70s who was brutally murdered one night, and suspicion quickly falls on her son. But her son is like, I didn't do it, but I know who did. Police have a hard time believing his story since it seems pretty out there. This case is solved, but it would take a long time to get to that point. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 136, The Case of Dorothy Donovan. This case takes us back to 1991. The Soviet Union officially dissolved. Operation Desert Storm began in January. Michael Jordan led the Chicago Bulls to their first championship. Nirvana's album Nevermind brought the beginning of grunge music. That album is still in heavy rotation in my life. Some iconic films came out in 1991, like Terminator 2, Silence of the Lambs, and Beauty and the Beast. A photo made its rounds in the media of Mike Tyson walking his exotic tigers. And in weird news from 1991, a cat named Grandpa Rex Allen became the world's oldest cat at age 34. There was one other cat who lived longer, and that cat lived to be 38. The crazy part is that they were both owned by the same old man. He said lots of healthy food was the key to long lives in felines. This story happened in Harrington, Delaware. I grew up in Delaware with my dad, and we had one newspaper. The News Journal covered all of Delaware. I was 10 years old in 1991, and I picture my dad sitting at the table reading the paper like he did every day. There wasn't any social media back then, so grown-ups loved their newspapers. I'm positive my dad came across this story of Dorothy Donovan in our newspaper, and I wish he was still alive to talk about it with me. On June 22, 1991, 40-year-old Charles Holden had just finished up his shift. Charles works second shift at the DuPont factory in Seaford, Delaware. He got off work sometime around midnight to 12:30 a.m. Charles lives alone in a trailer in Harrington, Delaware. The trailer sits on 160 acres. His mother, Dorothy, lives in a big older farmhouse right next door to his trailer. Dorothy lives alone as well. It was great for both of them being right next door to each other. If mom needs anything, she just calls her son next door and he comes over and helps with whatever she needs. On this particular night, Charles grabbed his lunchbox and punched out of work and was heading home to his trailer, but he wanted to stop and grab a bite to eat. So he pulls into the Hardee's on 13 and goes inside and grabs a burger and a coffee. As he gets back in his truck to leave, he's startled because a man comes up and knocks on his window. The middle of the night and someone comes up and knocks on my driver's window, I'd probably spill my coffee everywhere. Charles rolls his window down and asks, "Can I help you?" The man says he's in a bind. His sister is having a baby at the hospital in Milford and he needs a ride. Charles is reluctant and kind of thinks it over for a moment. He's tired and just got off work. No judgment from me whatsoever if Charles said no. I wouldn't feel crazy about this either. Charles had noticed him asking other people for a ride when he first got to the Hardee's, so he likely began to feel sorry for him. He says, "Fine, I'll give you a ride, but not all the way to the hospital. But I'll take you up the road a bit." They drive for a few miles, and then Charles pulls over. He tells the man, "That's it, time for us to part ways. There's a payphone over there by that garage. You can call someone to take you the rest of the way." Charles doesn't want the man to see where he lives, so he lets him out before they would get near that point. Where Charles is dropping the man off is about a quarter to a half mile from his house, but you'd have to make a turn to even get to Charles Road. Charles says up until that point, everything seemed fine. According to the News Journal, It was at this point that the man became very angry. He yells for Charles to drive, but Charles tells him, "No, get out." Charles tells the man to calm down and reminds him that he told him he was only going to take him a few miles. The man picks up a long screwdriver in Charles' truck and tells him he's going to kill him. He tells him, "Give me your money and your truck." Charles grabs the keys out of the ignition and gets out of the vehicle. The man jumps in the driver's seat and tries to drive, but Charles has the keys. The man gets out and the two begin fighting. Charles had spilled his coffee in the truck and burned his hand pretty bad. Now he's outside fighting. This poor guy who was trying to do something good and give this stranger a ride has suddenly found himself fighting for his life. This guy is wielding this long screwdriver he found in the truck and using it as a weapon. There's a mechanic's garage nearby, so Charles takes off running and begins banging on the windows, but no one is there at this late hour. The man is running after him and telling him, "I'm going to kill you." Charles finally stops to catch his breath and tells the man, "Fine, I'll take you. Get in the truck." Charles gets in and the man walks around to the other side. But before he could get in, Charles reaches over and locked the passenger side door. Then he floors it, leaving the man behind in the night. Charles knows he can't go home. He was only about a half mile from his house when he and the man got out, but he can't go home now because he doesn't want this person to know where he lives. So instead, he drives around for a short while. His hand is burnt from the coffee and his face is hurting from the fight he'd just been in. He doesn't want to call the police. He may blame himself for what happened by picking the guy up in the first place. He circles back when he feels the coast is clear and the man has moved on. He pulls into his driveway and sees a shadowy figure lurking around his trailer. There is no way possible this man figured out where he lived because he was super careful not to turn around and go down that road. He didn't even allude to the man that he lived down that road, but here we are. He sees the man looking in his windows. How on earth did this man find out where he lived? Now he has no choice but to call the police. He's concerned about his elderly mother who lives alone right next door. So he drives back to the Hardys so he can use the payphone. At 1:19 a.m., a call is placed to Delaware State Police from the Hardys. He tells the operator the story, and now this man has somehow discovered where he lived. He's prowling around outside his home, and his elderly mother is next door, and she lives alone. Charles says, "I need an officer to meet me here at the Hardys, and we'll go to my house together." As Charles waited, he tries calling his mom, but doesn't get an answer. Of course, she's 70 years old. Most people that age wouldn't answer the phone at 1:30 a.m., but his mother, Dorothy, always stayed awake until Charles got home from work. He works second shift, and Dorothy would wait until she saw his lights turn in the driveway, and she would know he's safe in his trailer next door. Then she'd turn her lights off and go to bed. You know how you worry about your kids no matter the age? Charles is 40 and she is still waiting up for him at night to come home. This just shows how amazing of a mom she is. Charles is likely wrestling with his thoughts. Should he drive home and make sure his mom's okay, or stay and wait for police to escort him? I'm sure this went through his mind a million times since that night. This call to police was treated as low priority because it wouldn't be until after 3 o'clock a.m. when an officer finally pulls into the Hardys. Charles and this officer go to the trailer and they don't see the man there. The door is still locked, windows are intact. It doesn't look like anything happened here at the trailer. But nothing could prepare them for what they'd find next. Charles tells the officer his elderly mother lives next door. Let's make sure she's okay. Dorothy's farmhouse is around 60 feet away. They make their way over there and they go to the back door first. They find the window in the back door is broken. They go into the house and Charles begins calling out for his mom. He listens and doesn't hear any response. Charles and the officer head upstairs to where Dorothy's bedroom is. Inside her bedroom was a gruesome scene. Dorothy was deceased. She had been stabbed over 25 times in the chest area, the neck, the face, and her arms. It was absolutely horrific, and blood is everywhere. Blood splatter analysis had their work cut out for them this night because there is blood spray on everything. the ceiling, the walls, all over her bed. She was positioned in the bed, and police describe it as being sexual in nature. But an exam would show that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. She was just positioned like she was. Her purse was untouched, nothing in the house was stolen. So we've ruled out sexual assault and we've ruled out robbery. Was he really just mad at Charles for not giving him a ride and decided to kill his mother as revenge? The problem is that there's no way the man knew where Charles lived. There were other houses around. It wasn't just Charles and his mom who lived on the street. Plus, again, he would have had to turn down a road to get to the house. They don't have a definitive instrument that stabbed her, but say it could have been a knife or possibly a long screwdriver. Let's talk about our victim, Dorothy. She is 70 years old. She has a 40-year-old son named Charles, who you all are familiar with. She also has 2 adult daughters. Dorothy loves spending time with her children and grandchildren. She was known to call her 2 daughters every single day. She spoke to Charles every day because he lived next door to her. I read that she actually packed Charles lunch for him to take to work each night. She was 70, but still doing the same tasks she did when he was a child. That's some serious motherly love. Dorothy was married to a man named Waltz, who passed in 1958. Her second husband, Ralph, passed away in 1987, just 4 years before our story. Dorothy loved gardening and was a member of Milford Church of God. She loved spending time at church and the local senior center where they had bingo and community events for seniors. She enjoyed canning vegetables and reading her Bible. She's basically just your average grandma. She had no enemies and wouldn't harm a soul. She didn't deserve to have her life stolen from her. Dorothy had told her daughter recently that she felt something was off. She felt like something was going to happen to her. Her children reassured her everything was fine. Nothing is going to happen to you, Mom. They made sure her windows were secure and she was safe, but Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that death was near. She felt something ominous was on its way. This may just be Dorothy aging and getting paranoid, or it could be she was psychic and predicted her own death. I've heard of people who can sense when something terrible is brewing. Dorothy is one of those people. I've heard another form of this in animals. Some animals are able to predict earthquakes and hurricanes and other natural disasters through vibration days before they happen. For some reason, Dorothy felt that her life was in danger. On the day of her murder, Charles had stopped by to see his mom before he left for work and pick up his lunch. His mom wasn't feeling well and basically just told him, "Here's your lunch." That's all she said. Charles had to see his mom after her death. He and that officer were the ones who found her. Charles was feeling overwhelming guilt for giving that man a ride. Here he thought he was doing some good deed and his mom is now dead. Charles says out loud, "I can't believe he killed her." Charles is brought back to the Delaware State Police Station. This is where Charles should have been given a blanket to wrap himself in, a cup of coffee, and some compassion as he tells the police everything that happened that night. Instead, he senses bad vibes from the police. This man just lost his mother, and he's kind of getting the cold shoulder from detectives. Charles tells them the whole story, from the time he got off work till right now. Everything that has happened these last few hours. Charles lays it all out. One detective tells him, "You must think I'm an idiot if you think I'm going to believe this story you're telling us. You're telling us you picked up a stranger, got in a fight, left him there, and he suddenly found out what house you lived in and went next door and killed your mother?" Charles says, "Yes, that's exactly what happened." Police aren't buying it. At this point, I'd be freaking out. I'd stop talking and demand a lawyer. But Charles just keeps on getting grilled. Detectives believe that there is just too many coincidences and it isn't adding up. They're asking him why he killed his mother. He's like, "I didn't kill my mother. This man I gave a ride to did. I saw him outside my trailer lurking around, so I went and called police, and we get to the house hours later and she's murdered." Charles had no criminal history. He was a traffic ticket kind of guy, but police seem to think he killed his mother and concocted this elaborate story. I tried to put myself in their shoes. Yeah, the story is outlandish. It is super coincidental, but Charles is confident he didn't kill his mom. He says it was the hitchhiker he gave a ride to. They tell him Dorothy's time of death was around 1 a.m. Charles called the police at 1:19 a.m. He had to be their killer. It's all too coincidental. They tell him, fine, humor us. They ask him to describe the man who they believe Charles made up. He says he's a younger black man with a clean-shaven face. He's wearing oversized plastic glasses. They take notes, but they don't believe a word he's saying. At one point, the detective yells that he's going to get the death penalty. Tell us the truth about what happened. But Charles stuck to his story. The interview was painful to watch. Charles appears really confused, which is why I totally believe his story. He can't believe that no one believes him. Dorothy being stabbed over 25 times is considered a crime of passion. This is something very personal. Strangers usually don't overkill. However, over the years of bringing you guys these stories, I'm beginning to believe that these traits usually seen in crimes of passion aren't a real thing anymore. Look at Samantha Josephson. Her killer was a complete stranger and stabbed her 120 times. The police ask Charles to take a polygraph, and he declines. Like most of us would. Back in the 80s and 90s, polygraphs were a more powerful tool to determine guilt or innocence than today. Now a lot of people will just decline them. I don't blame Charles. He just lost his mother. He's feeling all kinds of emotions. If that machine picked up the slightest sense of nervousness, it would be all over the place that he failed a lie detector test. If you have anxiety, you will likely fail the test. Polygraphs are only about 60-70% accurate, and most states won't allow polygraph results to be admissible in court since they're not scientifically reliable. So if you are ever asked to take a polygraph, please seek advice from your lawyer before taking one. Don't just say yes right away. Police believe Charles killed his mom. You could say they had tunnel vision at this point. They're not even out looking for this other man. Because Dorothy had been stabbed so many times, they assume it's a crime of passion, and because she was posed sexual in nature, it appears the scene was staged. Why would the killer leave her in a position like that if he didn't sexually assault her? They know Dorothy has no enemies, and their main focus is proving that Charles did this. Detectives who first entered the house that night of the murder noted that the house had a lot of furniture. Dorothy's purse was sitting downstairs and it still had money in it. The back door window was broken, but she never got out of bed to investigate it, which means she had to be sound asleep at the time or she was hiding in her bed. So most of the time when a child kills their parent, the motive is almost always financial. They gain financially from it, unless you're the rare case like Eric and Lyle Menendez, who endured years of sexual abuse and took matters into their own hands, but they also gained financially from their parents' deaths. So what would Charles gain from his mother being dead? Police learned some new information, and it does not help Charles whatsoever. In fact, it hurts his side of the story. It made it much worse. Police learned that Dorothy had recently taken out a life insurance policy on herself. Charles was one of the beneficiaries. He's probably thinking Mom did this at the worst possible time. They learned Charles was in debt and facing financial hardship. What better way to erase all this than by collecting a large life insurance policy? All the debt would just magically go away. This whole situation is causing a rift in the family. Charles' sisters don't want to believe that he killed their mom, but evidence is mounting and things are pointing in that direction. Charles never gave in. He kept the same story each time. A hitchhiker asked him for a ride. He asked him to get out part way. They got into a fight. Charles takes off before he could get back in. He returns and the man is lurking around his trailer. He comes back with police a couple hours later and finds Dorothy dead in her bed next door. That's his story and he's sticking to it. If Charles is telling the truth, I believe the entire state of Delaware owes him an apology. His sisters are feeling some kind of way about him. Even if he didn't kill their mom, he brought this stranger into his truck and put their mom at risk, even though Charles didn't drive near his house. It wasn't like he pulled up to Mom's house and said, well, this is where me and my mom live. Time for you to get out and find a ride the rest of the way. Charles had to go to work every day knowing people were whispering about him. All of this while dealing with the grief of losing his mom in this horrific manner. It had to be a really dark time if he's telling the truth. As well, his mother's real killer is still out there. No one is looking for him since they're all so focused on Charles. Detectives tell Charles the jig is up. Now we have proof that you killed your mom. Charles is like, oh, really? I would love to see that. So the killer left a bloody palm print on the rail banister leading up to the upstairs. He also left his or her DNA on the broken window in the back door. He likely punched it and cut himself, is my best guess for why there's DNA there. And he also left blood on a light switch. So they compare the blood to Charles' blood, and it's not a match. They compare the bloody palm print found on the banister, and it wasn't a match either. Charles is probably like, I told you. At this point, they can eliminate Charles as a suspect, but they're not completely satisfied in doing that because they begin to shift their focus to maybe you didn't do it, but maybe you hired someone instead. Maybe it was this man you keep describing. In order to rule out this theory, police have to talk to others. So they were able to track down some of the customers who were at Hardee's that night. That Hardee's was really popping at 12:30 a.m. because there was quite a few people who were there. These customers said a black man wearing big plastic glasses was going around to people and asking for a ride. One witness said she saw the man approach Charles' truck and tap on the window and saw them talking for a moment, and then Charles allows him to get into the passenger side. Another witness, who was a few miles away, said he saw two men get out of a truck. He described them exactly as Charles and this other man. He says they got out of the truck and began fist fighting. Police quickly realized that maybe Charles is telling the truth. Maybe as crazy as this story is, it might just be for real. The police come up with a lineup of photos. It consisted of 5 or 6 men who look like the suspect that Charles described. All are black men with glasses, and they are all known criminals in the area. They show it to Charles and ask him if any of them are the man. Charles points to one of the men and says, "That's him." They take this same lineup of photos to the Hardee's patrons who were there that night. Each one pointed to the same man that Charles did, a man by the name of Robert Mitchell. When police get to Robert Mitchell, they immediately know that it's not him, even though several people, including Charles, picked him out of a lineup. The man who was the suspect was clean-shaven. Robert Mitchell had a full-grown beard. He couldn't have grown this full beard in a couple weeks. It would have taken months to get to that length. So Robert Mitchell is ruled out. Lucky for him. Imagine having 6 people pick you out of a lineup. If he answered the door and he was clean-shaven, it would be game over. You're done and the case is closed. That's scary to think about, especially with how much these cops tried to convince Charles that he killed his mom. They have no issue pitting this on anybody. Police are back to square one. Who left this bloody palm print and DNA in this house? It has to belong to somebody. It's not Charles and it's not Robert Mitchell. The U.S. has a large database of fingerprints, but this database doesn't contain palm prints, so they can't use the database to identify this palm print. But what they can do is upload this DNA to CODIS and wait. In 1991, CODIS wasn't what it is today. Back in the early 90s, CODIS was still an FBI pilot project. It didn't become fully operational until 1998. Now it's grown millions since then. Time is of the essence in murder cases. They can go from hot to cold in just a short time. Dorothy deserves justice, but that justice will take a long time to come. Residents in Delaware felt like the police wasted so much time focused on Charles that this gave the real killer time to get away. He could be living across the country by now. In 1994, Delaware newspaper The News Journal ran a story that Unsolved Mysteries would be profiling the Dorothy Donovan murder in hopes that it would drum up some leads. Producers felt that this murder is perfect for television because there's a lot of drama and the son was a suspect, then he wasn't a suspect. It's bizarre. Plus, the case seems solvable. In 2001, the News Journal ran another story about Dorothy Donovan. It's been 10 years since her murder, and there's still been no arrests. The article read that the FBI is now involved. There was a Delaware State police officer that was training for the FBI, and he brought this case up to his superiors. The FBI is really good at profiling killers, so this will hopefully help get some answers. The FBI's theory is that this killer is a male and knew Dorothy well. He was familiar to her, which is why she never got out of bed. Mark Safarik of the Behavioral Science Unit said, quote, This is someone who knows the victim, knows her well, and they can come here and she will be the only person in the house. Mark and another FBI agent go to this farmhouse. It's been a decade since the murder, but they want to see what they can find. They noticed every single floorboard creaked as they made their way up the stairs of this 148-year-old house. They're looking for anything that the detectives might have missed 10 years ago, but everything seemed accounted for. But they say that broken glass at the back door was staged. It wasn't to gain entry to the house, but rather to make it look like someone broke in. This person, in their belief, had their own key. A pillow was found over Dorothy's face, which could indicate this killer didn't want to look at her while they killed her. The FBI concluded that this was someone very close to Dorothy. They say the killer had to know the layout of the home because he managed to escape without disturbing anything else. In May 2004, the CODIS system was now operating really well, and old crimes are getting solved left and right. So they uploaded the killer's DNA. In November 2005, 14 years after Dorothy's murder, they have a hit. A man who was just released from prison in Maryland. So in Maryland, if you do time, before you finish your prison sentence, authorities have to take your DNA, which I believe is a great tool, and I wish more states did this. He had been in prison for the last 7 years for murder. Don't ask me why he's being released from prison after 7 years for murder. So this man gives his DNA as a condition of his release. Voila, we have a match to a cold case in Delaware from 1991. Maryland police immediately notify Delaware and say, "Are you ready for this?" It was a man by the name of Gilbert Cannon. Gilbert is 41 years old, making him around 26 at the time of Dorothy's murder. In 1991, he was living in Delaware. Police try to locate Gilbert, but they can't find him anywhere. It wouldn't be until January 2006, which is 2 months after the DNA match, that they found Gilbert Cannon at his girlfriend's house in Maryland. He was charged with first-degree murder, possession of a deadly weapon during a felony, and first-degree burglary. When they get him back to the station, they run his palm print, and it was an exact match to the bloody palm print found on the railing. Gilbert tells police he's innocent. He says, "I didn't kill no old lady back in 1991. Police are like, "Yeah, whatever. We have your DNA. We have your palm print. Shut up." Gilbert is in his cell for a while. Then he knocks on the glass and tells police he's ready to talk. They sit him down and he tells the whole story. He has no reason to lie at this point because he knows he's done. He's been caught after evading police for 15 years. He says that night, back in 1991, he was very high on cocaine and just wanted to get more. He was walking outside of some fast food restaurant, and he says he walked up to a man in a truck and asked him for a ride. He said the man drove him for a few miles and then said he wasn't going to take him any further. Gilbert said he saw a long screwdriver in the truck and he was going to kill him with it. They got in a fist fight outside of the truck, and then the man got back in and took off. He says he started walking down Killen Pond Road. He went by a few houses and saw all of them had their lights on. So he went to the first house that didn't have any lights on and looked empty. He said his plan was to break in and go inside and sleep until morning. He said that when he broke the back glass on the door, it did wake an old lady up. He said he stabbed her multiple times with the screwdriver he found in Charles' truck so she wouldn't be able to identify him. What shocked investigators was that Gilbert had no idea that this woman was the mother of the man he just got the ride from. Even Gilbert was surprised. He had no idea all these years that that was the man's mother. He says she was just a random target. Her house was the first one that didn't have any lights on, so that's the one he went to. He also confirmed that he completely acted alone. No one else was involved. He had never met Charles before that day, so Charles didn't pay him to do this or anything like that. He says he was high on drugs and looking for a place to crash. Photos of Gilbert back in 1991 matched exactly what Charles described to police. On April 24, 2007, Gilbert pled guilty to first-degree murder. Delaware has the death penalty, at least they did up until 2024. Their last execution was 2012, but it was abolished in 2024. Gilbert didn't get the death penalty, though. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I can't find much on Charles Holden these days. I know one of his sisters, Dorothy's daughter, passed away in 2020 at the age of 66. I did read that he moved to Bridgeville, Delaware, away from he and his mom's home in Harrington. I hope Charles was finally able to grieve his mom properly while not being under investigation. Can you imagine what that man went through? Imagine trying to tell people what happened and no one believes you. He was looked down upon by family and friends and coworkers who truly believed he had something to do with his mother's death. I'm sure Dorothy would be upset to know that her son was investigated the way that he was. Rest in peace to Dorothy Donovan, a loving, deeply religious grandmom who died in a random act of violence. She is buried in Harrington, Delaware, next to her second husband, Ralph. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.